Welcome back, students, to INFS Information Sources, Session 3. We are going to look at selection and evaluation of reference sources. Let me explain this particular session to you. Reference sources have to be purchased for your collection. Reference sources are very expensive. Dictionaries, encyclopedias are very expensive. So you need to be able to do a careful selection. We have a criteria which guides us in the selection and evaluation of reference sources. Now, to make it easier for you to understand, let us assume you are going to buy a shoe or a particular dress for a particular occasion. There are a number of things that you consider before you buy that particular shoe or dress. The first one, which is obvious, is the occasion. The second one is the cost. You may also consider the quality. You may also consider the price. Now, these criteria that I have mentioned, which you would use in selecting either a shoe, a bag, or a dress, are similar criteria that we use in selecting reference materials, even though we may not use exactly the same. So if you're ready, let's go. Now, at the end of this session, you should be able to describe the criteria for selecting and evaluating reference sources. We are going to see how applicable these criteria are to electronic sources. Originally, these criteria were meant for print sources, but as time moved on, when we had a lot of electronic resources or the print sources coming out in electronic versions, we also started applying these criteria to them. Some of them is very easy to apply to electronic sources, but others are not too easy. So when we get to the others which are not too easy, I would mention which criteria you would use to be able to select and evaluate the print, the online version or the electronic version. So the topics we'll consider will be 3 main criteria for the first topic, and the second topic will look at the next 3, and the third topic will look in the absence of all these criteria, what are reference librarians using to be able to select and evaluate materials. Note, selection and evaluation does not come very easy. It's a tedious task. And to make work easier for us, librarians have compiled reviewing sources and guides to reference sources, or what we call the guides to the literature. So in topic 3 and topic 4, we'll look at these 2 guides which we use in place of the evaluation criteria. So let's start. The first thing you consider when selecting a reference source or a reference material is to look at the authority. Who wrote it? It's very important. You don't want anyone who is not knowledgeable in a field to write about a reference source. As I indicated earlier, a reference source is authoritative, and so you need somebody who is well versed in that particular area to be able to write about the reference source. So first, you consider the authorship. That is, what is the person's qualification? What is his experience? What is his educational background? Then you also consider, again on the authority, the auspices. Who is he publishing under, or who is she publishing under? What's the reputation of the publishing house or the sponsoring agency? Then you would consider the genealogy. Is the work new? Is the work based on a previous publication? Is the revision extensive? Now, it is important for you to consider the genealogy, because if you work in a library or an information center where you have a first edition or a second edition of a particular publication, and you know that the resources or the money to buy a new edition is very limited, you may consider whether the revision in the revision a particular edition is very extensive or it's not. If it is not, you decide probably to skip particular edition and go in for a subsequent edition. So under the criterion authority, there are three main issues you need to consider. Consider the authorship, consider the auspices, and consider the genealogy. Now, this criterion, and with all these issues under them, it's very easy to determine in a print publication. So you have a book in front of you, you can find out who wrote the book, who is the author. And then you can also find out who is the auspices or which publishing house is responsible for it. And then you can also find out what is the extent of revision, because the author would always tell you what is new in the second edition, what is new in the third edition, or in the fourth edition. However, if you have the online version, how will you be able to determine this criterion? Well, if you have the print counterpart, then you'll be able to say, well, the print counterpart with the electronic counterpart, it will also be published by the same author. But if you do not have the print counterpart, how are you able to judge the authority of this particular online version? You will only need to use documentation coming from the publisher or statements in the documentation coming from the publisher to be able to establish the authority of that particular database or particular CD-ROM material. Now, the next criterion that you need to consider when evaluating or when selecting a reference material is the scope. Under scope, you need to consider the purpose of the particular material. And the purpose is usually evident from the title, or from the contents, or from the introduction, or from the preface, or even from the index. You need to flip through the material in front of you to get the purpose. You also need to consider the coverage. What is the range of the subject matter and its limitation? And you also need to consider the currency, how up-to-date that material is. Now, for the criterion scope, again, we have three main issues that you consider: the purpose, the coverage, and the currency. Again, for this criterion, it's very easy to determine when you have a print resource. That means if you have the book in front of you, it's very easy to find out what is the purpose, what is the coverage, and what is the currency. But if you do not have the print version, how are you going to be able to determine the scope in an electronic version, especially when you don't have a subscription to the electronic version? Again, you depend on documentation, or you carry out simple searches from the home page. If you're lucky, it will give you some information which will help you to determine the scope of the particular document that you are looking at. So that is the second criterion we use in selecting and evaluating reference sources. Now let's look at the third criterion. That is the treatment. What do you mean by treatment? You need to look at the accuracy of the information contained in that particular reference source. How thorough is the information treated? How reliable is the information? Or how complete are the facts? Then you also look at the objectivity. Are there any biases in the information presented? That means, is the information balanced? If it is not, then you know that you should not be using that particular reference source. Then you also consider the style. What is the level of writing? Is it for the layman or for the scholar? And of course, you wouldn't want to buy a material meant for a scholar to put in, for instance, a children's library. So it is important to consider the style. So criterion 3, treatment, you need to consider the accuracy of the information, the objectivity of the information, and the style of writing. Again, all these issues very easy to confirm from a printed source. But with an electronic source, it is quite difficult. If you have the print counterpart, yes, you can assume that electronic counterpart will be based exactly on the print counterpart, so you are quite safe there. But if you don't have a print counterpart, you need to depend on the documentation presented by the publisher. Now let's look at the next criterion, which is arrangement. How is the information arranged in the material, in the reference material? So under arrangement, we have two main issues that are important. The sequence. How is information arranged? Does it follow a classified order? Does it follow a chronological order, a geographical order, a tabular order, or an alphabetical order? You would agree with me that any reference material which has an alphabetical order is very easy to use, even for the lay person, even for the child. Once you know your alphabet, you go from A to Z. So you need to know how the information is arranged in the particular reference material. You also need to know whether there is proper indexing. Now, indexes or an index refers to additional materials which help you locate the information from the source, from within the book. So consider a book index, for instance. And the index, you'll find it at the end of the book, which gives you a lot of information, gives you reference numbers where you'll be able to refer back into the book to get the information. Arrangement in a print material is very easy. So you just confirm what sequence there is and also whether there is indexing. With the online version, and this is one plus for online versions. All online versions are searchable. So you don't really need any arrangement in the online version because you just need to type in your keyword and it gives you the information. So this particular criterion does not, it's very irrelevant to online versions when we are doing the selection and evaluation because they are searchable anyway. Then the next criterion is format. So under format, consider the physical makeup. That is the binding, the paper, the typeface, the layout. Do they meet the minimum specifications? You also, under format, need to consider illustrations. Are they good quality? Are they significant? Illustrations are very important, especially in children's books. So, for instance, you wouldn't want to find in a children's book describing a market scene, but you would have the illustration which looks more like a church. That is bad illustration. And of course, with the format, it is easy for you to be able to determine this format when you have a print source. Very easy to use. What about the electronic source? With the electronic source, the format, of course, it's online. So that is what you have as format. So you won't be able to, unless of course you have a subscription, you won't be able to determine a few things, such as the quality of illustrations, because you need a subscription to be able to determine the quality of illustrations. And so you would depend again on documentations coming from the publisher. Now, if you have a CD-ROM format, what is good about CD-ROM formats? They store large amounts of information and they are also searchable. If you have an online format, what is good about online format is that they search, also enable you to do complex searching. They contain large amounts of information. In subsequent lectures, we will look at how you can search the online format, such as the online databases and the CD-ROM. We use what we call the Boolean logic to search. This will be done in subsequent lecture when we come to the internet. Then the next criterion is special features. Under special features, you need to look at what is unique or what is the selling point about these materials. So in a particular material, does it have tables? Does it have pictures? Does it have photographs? And these special features add to the usage of the particular reference materials. So these are very important when it comes to the reference material, special features. Under the electronic sources, you need to consider special features such as if they are available customer support, these are special features, or consider the availability of extra documentation or availability of training. These help with what you call the special features. Then the last criterion, known as cost. Cost is very relevant for everything. So the pricing of materials, the pricing of online databases, the pricing of CD-ROMs. If the cost of any material is so expensive, you will have to make a choice. For non-print materials, or what you call the online sources, you should note that the cost does not only include the cost of purchase of either the CD-ROM or the cost of purchase of the online bases, but there are other hidden costs or other upfront costs, such as maintenance of the equipment. You actually need a computer to be able to even use all these online databases and CD-ROM, and the cost of staff support, staff training. So the conclusion when it comes to costs, especially with the online materials, is to judge whether your users actually prefer the print materials or they prefer the online materials. If you have users who want quick, up-to-date information, then you would consider buying the online versions of materials for your users. Now, I have a popular acronym which I always give to students to enable them remember this criteria that I have described. So I call them AFSTAFs. AFSTAFs. So A for authority, F for format, S for scope, then T for treatment, A for accuracy, A for arrangement, F for format, and S for special features. And of course, the C doesn't appear, but you know that cost is very essential. So go back and look at AFSTAFs because it is very important for you to remember all the criteria and all the issues discussed under these materials. Now, if you are a reference librarian or acquisitions librarian and you have to select the resources, and you have to go using all the criteria that I have mentioned. That means the authority, the format, the scope, the arrangement, and all those ones before you select one book. This will be a very tedious work. And it will take you ages before you are able to select even 10 books for your library to purchase. Now, to facilitate this activity, reference librarians or reviewers have come together to put all new reference materials together in a book called a reviewing source. So let's look at what reviewing sources are. Now, reviewing sources are known as selection aids. They do the evaluation for us, and they compare new reference sources to enable the information professional make informed decisions. Now, reviewing sources vary in frequency, and you should note why it is important to use reviewing sources, because you as a professional, you cannot review all books before you purchase them, as I mentioned. You have to use all the 6 criteria to review one particular source, and that is very difficult. You wouldn't be able to do that for all the materials you purchase. So use reviewing sources. Now we have reviewing sources which cover a whole range of sources, a whole range of materials, a whole range of disciplines. So you find out which ones will be required for your work. Now, the criticism about reviewing sources are 2. 1, they can be very long. They take long in coming when they are properly reviewed by reviewers, or when they come out weekly. They are not reviewed at all. They just more or less carry out the descriptions given by the authors. So the longer they take, the better the review source. And another criticism is that they are generally favorable. They are descriptive rather than evaluative. And of course, nobody wants to spoil anybody's business. But for you, you need to read in between the lines to be able to know which of these 2 sources will be better for your library or center. So reviewing sources are useful in offering basis for assessing new reference works. So you should use them. You should also use supplements or information coming from flyers and catalogs. And one popular reviewing source which I always recommend is the American Reference Book Annual, ARBA. There are others that you can find in other publications, such as the Reference Book Bulletin and the Library Journal. Another reference material which you can use to enable you select materials is the guides to reference sources. In the previous session, I asked you to visit any library and look at these 2 guides. I mentioned Guide to Reference Book by Walford. I also mentioned Bailey's Guide to Reference Books. Now, what are these guides to reference sources? These are document finding tools, also known as bridges to information. They are very useful because they serve dual purposes as collection evaluation checklists and also selection tools for reference and collection development librarians. So if you need to do your selection and evaluation of materials, you do not need to go through the long way of looking at who the author is and who the arrangements in the materials are. You need to use what we call the guides to reference sources. So you have one guide, which is Bailey's Guide, and I'm going to ask you to review it. You've done it as an activity in the previous section. And then you also have Walford's Guide to Reference Materials. And so you also reviewed it in your previous session. So go back to your activity in the previous section and look at what you did for guides to reference sources. Well, as a repetition of the activity, please visit any library and look for the Bailey's Guide to Reference Books and look for the Walford's Guide to Reference Materials, as well as the American Reference Book Annual. Remember, that one is an example of a reviewing source. The first 2 are guides to the reference materials, or what we call the guides to the literature. A second activity which I'm going to ask you to do is to do a little write-up. And with this write-up, you will need to just come on the platform and discuss your answers. So tell us, what do you understand by evaluation of information sources? And then also tell us why it's especially important to evaluate information. So I expect that the platform will be very busy when you start doing this activity because you'll be sharing ideas with your colleagues. I have some references for you to be able to guide you with this particular session. I believe you have enjoyed this session, and please stay on for the next session. Thank you very much.